The rain has ceased, but London has not yet awakened. Somewhere beyond the mist, a carriage wheel turns, a clock strikes 5, and a secret long buried stirs once more. In a quiet study at Baker Street, a relic of forgotten ink will unearth the sins of a noble house and the conscience of England itself. Tonight's tale is not one of murder or theft alone. It is a pursuit through the corridors of history, where truth hides behind lineage and love turns to fear. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour finds you in its grasp? Share it below. I'd like to know who keeps company with London's dawn. Now, the lamps are lit, the fog presses against the window panes, and Holmes waits beside the fire for the chronicle that should never have been found. The hour grows late, and the mystery begins. It was upon one of those bleak February evenings when the cold seems to creep into one's very bones that I found myself seated opposite Holmes in our familiar Baker Street lodgings. Outside, London lay under a pall of frost. The gas lamps flickered dimly through the mist, and the occasional clatter of a distant hansom was swallowed by the stillness that hung over the city. Within, all was quiet comfort. The soft crackle of the fire, the low tick of the mantel clock, and the faint rustle of the Times as Holmes perused it with languid interest. He was in one of his introspective moods, his lean figure bent slightly forward, the lamplight falling upon the hawk-like sharpness of his features. I watched him in silence, knowing better than to disturb his thoughts when his mind turned inward. From time to time he uttered a brief remark, half to himself, half to me, upon the curious absurdities of human conduct reflected in the day's news. A man, he mused, may deceive a nation more easily than he deceives his own conscience. It was a moment of that rare domestic tranquillity which I had grown to value, the calm before one of those storms of adventure that so often broke upon our quiet evenings at Baker Street. The spell was shattered by a sudden and insistent knock at the door, sharp, hurried, and unnatural in the late hour. Holmes looked up instantly. The newspaper slid from his hand to the carpet. "You perceive, Watson," said he softly, "that our next visitor comes neither for pleasure nor politeness. There is fear in that summons." Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression anxious. Behind her stood a gentleman whose appearance bespoke exhaustion and distress. His greatcoat was flecked with melting snow. His hat trembled in his grasp. His lips were pale as parchment. Holmes rose at once and motioned him toward the fire. "Pray, sir, warm yourself," said he in his most soothing tone. "You have come to us in extremity. Let us see if we can lessen it." The man obeyed, sinking into the nearest chair as though the strength had left his limbs. For a moment he sat, silent, staring into the flames, his breath quick and shallow. Then, with an effort, he turned toward us, his voice quivering between fatigue and dread. "My name," he began, "is Alaric Venn. I am attached to the Royal Archives of London." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "A calamity has befallen me, gentlemen, one which may destroy both my career and my honour. A manuscript of incalculable value has vanished under my supervision." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his keen eyes fixed upon the speaker. "Proceed, Mr. Venn." "The document in question," said he, "is known as the Chronicle of St. Ethelric. It dates from the 13th century and is the only surviving record of certain ecclesiastical proceedings under the early Plantagenets. It was kept in a locked chamber within the west wing of the archives, to which only I and 2 assistants hold keys. Yesterday morning, during the routine inspection, I found the cabinet empty." His voice faltered. "The lock was unbroken, the windows are barred, and the corridor is watched. Yet the chronicle is gone. I have informed no one but you, Mr. Holmes, for should my superiors learn of this before it is recovered, I am ruined." As he spoke, the trembling of his hands betrayed the depth of his agitation. Holmes listened with grave composure, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You are wise to come to me," said he at length. "The fewer who know of the matter, the greater our chance of success." For an instant, It seemed that our visitor's courage faltered. He drew from his pocket a small notebook, opened it with nervous fingers, and hesitated. "There is one thing more," he said, his tone dropping almost to a whisper. "This theft is no ordinary act of avarice. The manuscript contains a passage, long hidden, little known, which refers to a matter of royal treachery." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes brightening. "Treachery, you say?" Venn nodded, perspiration beading his brow despite the chill. "A scandal of the most grievous nature, concerning the betrayal of the crown by a noble family, whose descendants still live and flourish. I chanced upon the passage only last week while verifying the catalogue entries. I had scarcely copied a portion when the Chronicle vanished." He looked from one to the other of us with desperate intensity. If the truth were made public, the consequences would be catastrophic, not only for the family concerned, but for the very institution I serve. My name would be dragged through the mire. I beg you, gentlemen, find the Chronicle, and with it, my peace of mind." Holmes rose slowly and approached the window. The street below lay wrapped in fog. The lamps burned like dull embers through the whiteness. "You have done wisely, Mr. Venn," said he at last. "A theft committed in silence without violence or trace suggests a motive both subtle and dangerous. It is not the thief's greed. That interests me, but his fear. Fear, my dear Watson, is the truest compass in our science." Venn bowed his head. "Then you will take the case?" "With pleasure," Holmes replied. "You may rely upon my utmost discretion." As our visitor gathered his hat and gloves, Holmes's gaze followed his every movement with hawk-like precision. "A moment, Mr. Venn," said he suddenly. "You have travelled some distance, from Westminster, I presume, and in haste. The smudge upon your left cuff is ink from a quill recently used, while the tear upon your glove suggests you seized something roughly, perhaps in anger. Yet I find no guilt in your manner, only anxiety. The theft occurred less than 24 hours ago, and you have told no one save ourselves. Am I correct?" The astonished curator stared at him in mute wonder. "You are perfectly right, Mr. Holmes. How could you possibly—" Holmes waved the question aside. "Observation, sir, is a habit which grows from necessity. You are a man accustomed to documents, not deception. That will be our advantage." When Venn had gone, the door closing softly behind him, Holmes stood for several moments lost in thought. Then, turning to me, he said in that low tone which always presaged the thrill of the chase, "There is more to this chronicle, my dear Watson, than the theft of parchment. We are dealing with the theft of history itself. Prepare yourself, for we tread upon ground where the living conspire with the dead." It was a pale and windless morning when Holmes and I set forth toward Westminster. A dense fog hung low over the city, turning each gas lamp into a wavering star and softening the outlines of passing carriages into spectral shapes. The damp clung to one's coat like a living thing, and the river, though unseen, made its presence known by the faint, ceaseless lap of water against stone. Holmes walked swiftly, his long stride and raised collar cutting through the mist like a blade through gauze. His silence was unbroken, save for an occasional impatient tap of his cane upon the pavement. "There is," he remarked at last, "a peculiar moral irony, Watson, in crimes committed among institutions devoted to preservation. The Royal Archives were built to guard memory, yet here, memory itself has been stolen." When we reached the great stone edifice, its facade loomed from the fog as though carved from the very silence of history. The sound of St. Margaret's bells drifted faintly over the rooftops, solemn and remote. Within, the corridors were chill and deserted, lined with shelves that seemed to breathe dust and antiquity. Mr. Venn awaited us at the entrance to the west wing, his face pale with anxiety and his fingers twisting a ring without thought. Holmes greeted him curtly, his eyes already darting toward the corridor beyond. "Lead us, if you please, to the chamber," said he, "and speak as little as possible." We entered a narrow passage that, opened into a tall, austere room illuminated by a single high window. The air was heavy with that peculiar odour of vellum and age which seems to linger in places where the past has long been undisturbed. Oak cabinets lined the walls, their locks polished from decades of careful handling. Mr. Venn, visibly agitated, pointed toward a reading table at the centre. "There," said he, "is where the Chronicle lay." Holmes approached the cabinet that had held the manuscript. The lock was intact. The key still hung from the warden's chain. He tested the latch. It yielded smoothly, with no sign of tampering. The cases around it were equally undisturbed. To the untrained eye, the room might have been untouched for centuries. Holmes went down upon one knee and examined the floor with his magnifying glass. "Observe, Watson," said he, "how the dust has been swept aside here, not by accident, but by intention. A single clean sweep, precisely where one would kneel to remove a heavy volume, yet no trace of footprints beyond that line. The thief understood the value of stillness. He rose, brushing the dust from his fingers. The Chronicle was taken not by brute force, but by one who moves comfortably in this environment, someone who understood locks, keys, and perhaps more importantly, discretion." Mr. Venn's lips trembled. "You mean one of my own staff?" Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "My dear sir, I mean only that the door was locked, the windows sealed, and the silence complete. Such conditions restrict the field of inquiry to the privileged few, and, I dare say, to the ambitious." Holmes's gaze shifted to the table itself, upon which a small pool of faintly discoloured wax clung to the polished surface. He murmured. "A seal, melted in haste." Producing a thin blade from his pocket, he gently lifted the fragment. "Note the impression, Watson, the faint trace of a bird's wing, perhaps a falcon or an eagle, half obliterated but sufficient to suggest heraldry rather than scholarship." He turned next to the chair beside the table, where a light grey smudge clung to the wood. "Ash," he declared, "and not common at that. A blend of Turkish leaf, mixed with a touch of Latakia, unmistakably Balkan Sobrani. A most distinguished indulgence, favoured by military men of experience and rank." Mr. Venn looked bewildered. "You mean that an officer—" "Possibly," said Holmes, straightening. "A soldier's habits die harder than his loyalties. You will recall, Watson, that the Chronicle spoke of treachery. It is conceivable that its theft has drawn the attention of those for whom loyalty is a fragile thing." He paced slowly around the table, his eyes darting over every inch of the room. The wax, the ash, the swept dust, each is trivial in itself. Yet together they form a pattern of contradiction. A scholar would handle a document with reverence. A thief would act with haste. But a soldier would act with discipline. He paused by the door and glanced back at the chamber. "There is method here, Watson, the precision of a trained hand. This was not an impulsive act, but one carried out with military efficiency. Let us see, then, which officer has mislaid his conscience among the relics of kings." Holmes requested to speak with the assistant who had first discovered the theft, and Mr. Venn promptly summoned her from the adjoining records room. A few moments later, Miss Eleanor Blythe entered, a young woman of serious countenance and quiet bearing, whose composure barely veiled her inward distress. Her eyes, of a clear grey hue, met Holmes's with the forthrightness of one unaccustomed to deceit. "I was the first to see it gone," she said, clasping her hands nervously before her. "The Chronicle was upon the table the night before. When I returned in the morning, it had vanished. The cabinet was locked, as always. Mr. Venn was still at home." Holmes regarded her keenly. "You heard nothing unusual during the night?" She hesitated. "Only footsteps, perhaps. They came from the corridor beyond the reading room. I thought it must be one of the watchmen, though no such entry appears in the log." As she spoke, a faint tremor passed across her voice. It was not fear of discovery, but fear of implication. Holmes, perceiving it, shifted the conversation gently. Your work here must often bring you into contact with visiting scholars or officials of high standing. Occasionally, she admitted. Members of Parliament, patrons, and… Her words trailed off. When Holmes asked whether any peers of the realm had visited the archives of late, her gaze flickered involuntarily toward the tall window overlooking the courtyard. Holmes's tone softened. You are an honest woman, Miss Blythe, and honesty rarely errs in silence. I thank you for your candour. When she withdrew, he turned to me with that familiar glint of thought that heralded a deduction forming in his mind. Holmes's next interest lay beyond the chamber itself. We passed through a narrow corridor that opened into the small inner courtyard adjoining the west wing. The fog had thickened, clinging to the stone like a shroud, and the chill air carried the faint metallic scent of frost and river mist. Holmes went down upon one knee beside the gate. Observe, Watson, he said quietly. Here we have a wheel track, narrow, double-rimmed and very recent. A light carriage, used not for transport of goods, but of persons. Note, too, how the right wheel has pressed deeper than the left. That tells of haste, or burden. He ran his hand along the hinge of the gate and withdrew a tiny shred of blue silk, scarcely larger than a thumbnail. Excellent, he murmured. A fragment torn by motion, the weave, fine as spider thread. Only the looms of Savile Row could produce such a pattern. Few paces further, he stooped again, touching a smear upon the stone step. Iron oxide, he said, rubbing it between finger and thumb. Not from hinges, the composition is too fresh. It has been transferred from an object of recent manufacture, possibly a case or tube of metal. Something carried in haste. I watched him as he pocketed both the dust and the silk with careful precision. Holmes, I ventured, do you suggest the thief departed by this gate? More than that, he replied, straightening his coat. I suggest he departed under privilege. Only certain persons possess the key to this passage, and the courage to use it. As we emerged once more into the outer court, Holmes walked beside me in reflective silence, his brow furrowed in thought. When at last he spoke, his voice was low, as though unwilling to disturb the echo of his own conclusions. The blue silk, the cigar ash, the iron dust, 3 worlds, Watson. Refinement, vice, and industry. They do not mingle by chance. He paused at the archway, the wind stirring the hem of his coat. We are standing, said he, at the threshold of a conspiracy where the scholar lends his hand, the soldier executes his purpose, and the nobleman conceals the motive. The Chronicle is but the key. The lock lies far higher than the cabinet that once held it. His eyes, gleaming in the fog, turned toward the distant spire of Westminster. Come, Watson, the game has left the chamber and entered the House of Lords. The following morning found Holmes seated in his armchair, the blue smoke from his pipe curling lazily toward the ceiling like some silent spirit of deduction. Upon the table before him lay the relics of our inquiry, a small fragment of blue silk, a dusting of reddish iron, and a pinch of fine grey ash, each placed upon a sheet of foolscap with the care of a jeweller arranging his gems. For near an hour he spoke not a word. I occupied myself with my notes from the previous day, occasionally glancing at him as he sat motionless, eyes half closed, his mind clearly absorbed in the invisible architecture of thought. At last he stirred. We possess, Watson, 3 things without apparent kinship, yet joined by the unseen hand of motive. The ash tells of a soldier, the silk of a gentleman, and the oxide of industry. Therein lies our trinity. He tapped the ash thoughtfully with his pipe stem. It is not the theft of a document that concerns me, but the effort taken to conceal its reason. When men of rank meddle with the past, they do so not for gold, but for fear. He rose suddenly, his eyes gleaming. Come, Watson, there is a tailor in Savile Row who may enlighten us more than a library full of histories. The establishment of Harrington and Blythe, purveyors of gentlemen's garments to half the House of Lords, stood discreetly between a jeweller's and a club of some antiquity. Holmes entered with that air of serene authority, which few could resist, and which, when combined with his impeccable attire, rendered him the very picture of distinguished inquiry. He greeted the senior tailor with a polite inclination of the head. "Good morning. I believe I may require your assistance in identifying a weave of considerable fineness, one which, I fear, only your establishment could have produced." From his pocket, Holmes produced the tiny shred of blue silk. The tailor took it between forefinger and thumb, examining it through a lens. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes," he said cautiously. "That is ours indeed, the lining of a gentleman's waistcoat, made some 6 months past. But I must decline to disclose the client's name." Holmes smiled faintly. "Of course, yet perhaps the matter of iron oxide may refresh your memory." At the mention of the word, the man's composure faltered. "Iron, you say, on such a fabric?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "A most unusual companion to Savile Row silk." After a pause, the tailor spoke in a lower tone. "The garment was commissioned by Lord Eustace Darnley, sir, a nobleman of distinction. But he is not in England. He has been abroad these several weeks." Holmes replaced his hat with deliberate calm. "Indeed, abroad perhaps, but not absent. I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Blythe." As we stepped back into the bustle of the Row, I remarked upon his faint smile. "You disbelieve him, Holmes?" "Entirely. A lie told by a frightened man, my dear fellow, is as revealing as truth from a brave one." It fell to me that evening to undertake a task of research, at Holmes's suggestion, within the reading room of the British Museum. "Seek the past of Lord Eustace Darnley," he had said. "It is not his present position that interests me, but the shadow which may lie behind his name." I confess that my curiosity was piqued. Among the musty volumes of peerage and record I found, after some effort, a reference to an incident long expunged from common history. A charge of high treason brought against Eustachius Darnley, an ancestor of the current lord, during the reign of Edward III. The record ended abruptly. A note in the margin indicated, "Pardon by royal decree." When I returned to Baker Street with my findings, Holmes received me with the calm satisfaction of one whose theory had already anticipated fact. "So," said he, turning the page of his notebook, "we discover that the Darnley honour rests upon a foundation of silence. A family whose forebear betrayed the crown would guard its memory as one guards a contagious disease. The Chronicle of St. Ethelric, which Mr. Venn so lamented, may well contain the unredacted truth, a truth that Lord Darnley would spend much to keep hidden." He leaned back, his eyes glinting through the haze of his pipe smoke. "The sins of the fathers, Watson, do not die. They merely sleep, waiting for the historian's pen to wake them. And when that happens—" he gestured toward the window, where the bells of Westminster tolled faintly through the mist, "men will kill for the privilege of keeping history asleep." It was late that afternoon when Holmes, after several hours of silent consideration, dispatched me to Fleet Street. "The pen, Watson," he said, "has slain more reputations than the sword, and perhaps this time it has drawn blood of its own." I found the journalistic quarter abuzz with rumour. The recent fire that had consumed the premises of Basil Trent, the radical pamphleteer, was on every tongue. His small printing office, known for its scathing exposés upon public men of rank, had been reduced to a shell of smouldering brick and ash. No one could say whether Trent himself had perished in the flames, though several swore to having seen him flee moments before the roof fell in. A compositor, soot-streaked and trembling, told me in confidence that Trent's last series of leaflets had hinted at a revelation from a sacred text of the Crown, words that struck me with immediate recollection of our own missing Chronicle. When I returned to Baker Street and relayed what I had learned, Holmes listened without comment, his face unreadable in the twilight. At length he said, "So the torch of truth burns too brightly, and someone has seen fit to extinguish it. No, Watson, this was no accident. Trent possessed the Chronicle, or part of it, and was silenced for it. The only question that remains, he added, gazing toward the fire, is whether Lord Darnley struck the match, or merely provided the hand that held it. That night, as the city's hum faded into the quiet rhythm of Baker Street, Holmes drew together the threads of the case with the air of one testing the tension of a finely spun web. "We have," said he, "two men bound by a single fear, the fear of revelation. One wielded truth as a weapon, the other buried it beneath the courtesy of his title." He paced before the hearth. "Picture it, Watson. Basil Trent obtains, by chance or purchase, the Chronicle of St. Ethelric. In its pages, he discovers the shame of a noble house, a secret fit to topple a reputation built upon ancestry. Lord Darnley learns of this and acts not through the law, but through the ancient means of silence, coercion, threat, and destruction. I ventured that such conduct seemed perilous for a man of standing." Holmes smiled thinly. "My dear fellow, the higher a man's station, the more invisible his sins become. Influence conceals what the gallows would expose. The fire at Trent's press was no mere calamity. It was purification. Of evidence, not conscience." He paused, then spoke in a tone of quiet gravity. "And yet, we must not err in haste. The great stage of power has many players, Watson. The true villain is not always the loudest actor, but the calm observer who directs the play from the shadowed box." Holmes leaned back, the lamplight falling upon his sharp features, and regarded me with a distant expression. "You have observed, I trust, the curious emotion that binds all involved in this matter. Fear." "Fear?" I repeated. "Yes. Mr. Venn fears ruin, Miss Blythe fears implication, Basil Trent feared the silence of the grave, and Lord Darnley fears the resurrection of his own blood's betrayal. But one man moves without fear, Watson, because he believes himself beyond the reach of it." His voice sank into a low, reflective cadence. "The calmest countenance in this affair is the most dangerous. The serenity of a guilty man, when absolute, is not peace, but armour. And the wearer of that armour stands nearest to us." He tapped the table thoughtfully. "We must therefore look not for agitation, but for ease, the one who smiles when others tremble. There, my dear friend, lies the architect of our mystery." With that, he rose, striking a match to relight his pipe. The brief flare cast his profile into stark relief, keen, unwavering, and utterly absorbed. "Tomorrow," he said, exhaling a thin plume of smoke, "we pay a visit to St. James's Square. It is time to meet serenity face to face." It was a curious evening even by Holmes's adventurous standards. By some ingenious contrivance, he had procured an invitation to Lord Darnley's reception under my professional name, explaining, with an amused smile, that a touch of medical pretext would admit us more readily than an official inquiry ever could. "Truth," said he, adjusting his tie before the mirror, "when cloaked in civility, passes most easily through guarded doors." As our hansom rattled towards St. James's Square, I confess that unease gnawed at me. The fog curled around the gas lamps, softening the stately facades into phantoms of wealth and secrecy. Holmes, however, appeared perfectly at ease, his eyes alert beneath half-closed lids. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, "how power advertises its virtue in marble and hides its guilt behind curtains." When we alighted before the grand entrance, I noted the crimson glow spilling through frosted glass, the hum of conversation within, and the faintest whiff of tobacco mingled with expensive perfume. Holmes's forged card gained us admittance without question. Inside, the blaze of light and luxury made me, for a moment, forget the purpose of our intrusion. Yet, even amid the splendour, I saw Holmes's expression harden. He had already begun his silent dissection of the company. A dozen glances sufficed for him to distinguish innocence from deceit. The Darnley drawing-room was a scene of cultivated magnificence. The walls gleamed with gilt-framed portraits. The chandeliers shed a golden haze upon politicians, judges, and soldiers exchanging whispers behind fans of etiquette. Yet beneath the glitter ran an undercurrent of tension, the air of a house too carefully arranged to seem natural. Holmes, presenting himself as a quiet man of medicine with antiquarian interests, was soon in conversation with our host. Lord Eustace Darnley possessed the polished ease of a statesman and the smile of one who measured every word. "We are honoured, Doctor," he said smoothly. "I am told you are something of a collector yourself." Holmes inclined his head. "Merely an observer, my lord, but I find that collections often tell us as much about their owners as their objects." Darnley laughed, a shade too heartily. His geniality, though outwardly flawless, carried the subtle stiffness of constraint. As he moved away to greet another guest, Holmes's eyes followed him with quiet intensity. "A man who smiles too readily, Watson," he murmured, "is a man at war with his conscience." I, meanwhile, noted how every servant's gaze lingered upon Darnley's gestures, as if trained to anticipate rather than assist. It was a household governed by vigilance, not ease. And through it all, the faint aroma of tobacco clung to the air, pungent, foreign, and curiously familiar. Amid the shifting tide of conversation, my attention was drawn to Lady Darnley, who sat apart upon a velvet settee, her embroidery frame resting idly upon her lap. She was of delicate constitution, her complexion pale, and her hands, fine and white, trembled even in repose. Holmes, perceiving my glance, led me toward her with courteous intent. "My friend Dr. Watson has made a study of nervous maladies," said he softly. "He may advise you, Lady Darnley, upon that slight tremor which afflicts your hand." She smiled faintly. "It is nothing, Doctor, merely fatigue." Her voice was low, musical, yet burdened with an inward strain. When Holmes, with apparent casualness, mentioned her husband's interest in medieval manuscripts, a shadow passed across her face. "Ah, his historical pursuits," she murmured, lowering her eyes to the crimson thread she had been stitching. "They occupy him greatly." Holmes bent slightly over the embroidery frame. "You have pricked your finger, I fear," he observed gently. Indeed, a small blot of dried blood marred the thread. She drew the fabric hastily aside. "A trifling accident," she said, her voice unsteady. As we withdrew, Holmes's expression was grave. "You saw it, Watson. The tremor, the evasion. That lady's burden is moral, not medical. She fears not exposure, but silence, a silence she herself has purchased." We had scarcely left her side when we were joined by a man of martial bearing, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and possessed of that self-assured geniality peculiar to the officer class. He introduced himself as Colonel Ashcroft, an old friend of the Darnleys. Almost at once, the rich, unmistakable aroma of Balkan Sobrani tobacco reached my nostrils. I caught Holmes's swift glance. It was the same rare blend whose ashes we had found in the archives. The Colonel drew upon his cigar with leisurely confidence. "A splendid evening, is it not? Though I confess, I prefer the quiet of the mess to this sort of pageantry." Holmes engaged him in conversation, speaking lightly of campaigns and regiments. I watched my companion's manner grow almost languid, though his eyes never left the man's hands. A small fleck of grey ash fell to the carpet, and Holmes's gaze followed it as a hawk follows prey. "Curious affair at the Royal Archives," he remarked suddenly. "A manuscript gone astray, I hear." The Colonel started ever so slightly, then laughed, too loudly, too quickly. "Nonsense, sir. These newspaper tales magnify every trifle." Yet his fingers tightened about his glass, and the smoke from his cigar wavered as if disturbed by the tremor of guilt. When he moved away, Holmes's expression hardened. "Our soldier smokes the same blend as our thief," he said quietly, "and the air about him reeks not merely of tobacco, but of complicity." Before we departed, Holmes proposed with feigned enthusiasm that we should admire Lord Darnley's celebrated collection of portraits and artifacts. Our host, with the pride of a connoisseur, led us through a narrow passage to a smaller study adjoining the main room. The air within was heavy and still, as though seldom disturbed. My eye was immediately caught by a great tapestry depicting the coronation of a medieval king, its faded gold threads glinting faintly in the lamplight. Holmes's gaze, however, lingered upon a slight bulge at the centre, a distortion so subtle I might never have noticed it. "A fine work," said he, stepping closer. "Yet it seems to suffer from the weight of time." Darnley's lips curved in a tight smile. "Old fabrics seldom keep their shape, Mr. Holmes." Meanwhile, upon the writing desk stood a mahogany cabinet, its brass key newly polished. Holmes bent over it, touching the handle with a gloved hand. "Ah, and here the centuries sleep once more," he murmured. "You are a guardian of history, my lord." Something in his tone caused Darnley to stiffen. "Do you find our little antiquities amusing?" he asked, his voice silk over steel. Holmes straightened, his expression perfectly courteous. "On the contrary, deeply instructive." For a moment the two men regarded one another, the detective calm, the nobleman pale. Then Darnley turned away with an impatient gesture. "Come, gentlemen, the orchestra awaits." As we followed him back toward the crowd, Holmes leaned close and whispered, "Behind that tapestry lies concealment. Whether of object or of conscience, I cannot yet say. But note, Watson, how guilt protects itself, not by locks, but by ornament." It was near midnight when we took our leave. The fog had thickened in the square, muffling the sound of carriages and dimming the once splendid glow of the house behind us. For a while, Holmes walked in silence, his head bowed, the collar of his coat turned up against the chill. At last he spoke. "The Colonel's cigar betrayed him," he murmured, "but the tremor of a lady's hand may yet reveal the greater theft. Not of parchment, but of conscience." I asked whether he believed Lord Darnley to be the culprit. Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. There is guilt within those walls, Watson, guilt shared and concealed. But to expose it, we must first learn whose honour was truly stolen." He paused beneath the gaslight, his face pale in the mist. "Tonight we saw a house glittering with privilege, yet hollowed by fear. It is there, amid splendour and silence, that truth will make its entrance, and its price will not be small." As we turned toward Baker Street, I glanced back once more. Through the fog, the Darnley mansion appeared less a home than a monument, to secrets and to shame. It was barely past 9 the next morning when a telegram from Scotland Yard arrived, its brief message carrying more enthusiasm than substance. "Assistant of Basil Trent arrested, case practically solved, Lestrade en route." Within the hour, our old acquaintance burst into Baker Street with the air of a man vindicated before his critics. He greeted Holmes with unconcealed triumph. "We've got him this time," he declared, rubbing his hands briskly. "The fellow was caught trying to sell fragments of the missing vellum. They were found on his person, burned but identifiable." Holmes, who sat cross-legged upon the armchair, regarded him with polite detachment. "Indeed? How reassuringly simple, Lestrade." "Yes, simple enough," said the inspector, "and conclusive. The papers bear traces of the Chronicle's Latin text. I thought you'd like to know the Yard has done its duty, despite your, unconventional theories." Holmes smiled faintly and steepled his fingers. "My dear Lestrade," he said, "you mistake the dawn for the day. I fear your triumph will fade faster than the ink upon those scraps." Lestrade frowned. "You mean they're forgeries?" "I mean," Holmes replied softly, "that you have caught a man who may be guilty of something, but certainly not this. What you hold is not proof, but a shadow pretending to be substance." His eyes glinted in the lamplight. "A false dawn, Lestrade, as brief as it is blinding." Lestrade, with his usual mixture of irritation and curiosity, watched as Holmes laid out the charred remnants upon a porcelain tray. "If you will allow me the liberty," Holmes said, "we shall determine whether your vellum was once centuries old, or merely days." He produced a small vial and a glass rod, applying a few drops of clear reagent to the fragment. Instantly, the surface darkened, exuding a faint metallic sheen. "There," said Holmes. "Iron gall ink, a fine imitation of medieval composition, but too precise in its uniformity. Genuine documents of that age show irregularity from handmade ink. This, I assure you, was prepared within the month." Lestrade leaned forward. "But the Latin—" "Copied, no doubt," Holmes interrupted, "from a printed source. The parchment itself is of modern origin, chemically bleached, artificially aged. Observe how cleanly it burns. Real vellum leaves an oily residue. Your assistant was carrying bait, not treasure, a decoy meant to deceive both buyer and constable." Lestrade's expression collapsed into reluctant disbelief. "Then we've been chasing smoke." Holmes replaced the tray with quiet precision. "Precisely so. The fire that consumed Trent's press was more than literal. It was metaphorical, a cleansing of evidence, leaving the yard to admire the ashes." As the inspector departed in gloomy silence, Holmes turned to me. "A forgery to distract, a servant to sacrifice. Someone writes the play, Watson, and lets others perish in its performance." Holmes's energy redoubled once Lestrade had gone. "The answer, my dear Watson, lies not in what was taken, but in what remains." We returned that afternoon to the Royal Archives, where the corridors lay deserted save for Mr. Venn, pale and hollow-eyed after nights of sleepless anxiety. He led us, without a word, back to the room where the Chronicle had vanished. Holmes approached the reading desk and began his examination anew, producing from his pocket a small bottle containing a faintly luminescent reagent. "Wood, especially oak, retains the pressure of a pen," he murmured. "A thief may erase ink, but never indentations." He brushed the solution lightly across the polished surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, under the wan light filtering through the high window, faint impressions began to rise. Ghostly lines and curves as, though the desk itself whispered its memory of the missing manuscript. Mr. Venn gasped aloud. Holmes bent low, reading with absorbed intensity. "Here we have it, not the words, but their shadows. A hasty hand copied something from the Chronicle mere hours before its theft. A mind desperate to preserve, or destroy, knowledge." He turned to me with quiet satisfaction. "The parchment was not the only witness, Watson. Even silence leaves its imprint." Holmes worked in complete absorption, tracing the faint letters with a magnifying lens. Slowly the outline of phrases emerged, a patchwork of Latin, broken yet legible enough to stir unease in the heart. "Eustatius D. Pejurium coram corona," Holmes translated softly. "Eustatius D. Perjury before the crown." He straightened, his face grave. "You recognize the name, Watson?" "Eustachius Darnley," I murmured, feeling a chill. "Precisely. The ancestor whose ghost walks through this entire affair." The shadows of words continued faintly across the grain. Half sentences, hints of betrayal, a royal decree redacted by silence. Holmes examined each as though unearthing bones from consecrated ground. "The thief," he said at length, "was no plunderer. This was the act of a scholar, or an agent of one, who understood the weight of what he handled. The Chronicle's missing page did not vanish to enrich a pocket, but to preserve a name." He replaced the reagent bottle and turned to Mr. Venn, whose face was ashen. "Take heart, sir. You have been robbed not by ignorance, but by intellect, and that, though perilous, is a compliment of sorts." As we left the archives, Holmes's words lingered in my thoughts. The past had spoken through the desk's surface, and its voice was accusation. Back at Baker Street, the pieces began at last to cohere into their grim design. Holmes laid his instruments aside and sat motionless, his brow furrowed. "We have pursued ink and ash, Watson," he said. "Yet the trail has always returned to iron." He spread before him the small sample of reddish dust we had gathered at Westminster. "This residue, when examined under the lens, contains traces of ferric oxide. precisely the kind found on the casing of a surveyor's instrument. You recall, of course, Colonel Ashcroft. Perfectly. Then you recall also his steady hand, his military precision, and his cigar. The man smuggled truth with the same calm with which he once carried dispatches under fire. The Chronicle was rolled and sealed within an iron tube, a theodolite case most likely, and carried openly past every guard as legitimate equipment. He leaned back, eyes half closed. It is a method as old as war, conceal danger in the guise of duty. When secrecy demands strength, men of war are ever the chosen couriers. Ashcroft is no mere accomplice. He is the link between privilege and execution. I asked whether he intended to confront the colonel. Holmes's reply was measured. Soon, but not yet. We have reached the brink of revelation, and to cross it prematurely is to drown in conjecture. There remains one more piece, Watson, the will behind the soldier's hand. His voice fell almost to a whisper. For every act of treachery, there is one who commands it from comfort, and signs it perhaps with a trembling hand. That night, the atmosphere of Baker Street was heavy with foreboding. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across Holmes's austere figure as he stood at the window, gazing into the fog-draped street below. I sensed in him a stillness that precedes danger. Not hesitation, but calculation. You feel it too, Watson, he said quietly. We stand upon the bridge between history and crime. One more step, and both may collapse beneath us. He turned, his eyes catching the glow of the embers. Darnley hides behind centuries of honour, Ashcroft behind the decency of service, and yet both are bound by a single chain, forged in fear. It is that chain we must break. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The clock marked the passing seconds with relentless composure. Outside, the fog pressed against the panes like some restless spirit seeking entry. Holmes finally seated himself and stirred the coals. Tomorrow, he said softly, we draw the curtain and see who dares remain upon the stage. The last flame flared and died, leaving the room bathed in crimson twilight. The unmistakable calm before revelation. The hour was late, and London lay under one of those dense November mists that seemed to stifle even sound itself. Holmes and I sat silently within a cab that followed, at a discreet distance, the carriage of Colonel Ashcroft. The horse's hooves struck the stones with a dull rhythm that echoed through the vapour like the beating of a weary heart. Holmes, his features barely visible in the gloom, leaned forward to peer through the misted glass. You perceive, Watson, he murmured, that our gallant colonel keeps to the southward route, not toward his club, but the river. The Thames has ever been London's final confessional. Its secrets sink faster than its sinners. We turned down narrower lanes, where the air grew colder and rank with the odour of tar and stagnant water. No word passed between us. The faint lamplight from Ashcroft's carriage was our only guide, bobbing and dimming like a will-o'-the-wisp across the fog-draped streets. At length, the road descended to the old Wapping wharves, where the river whispered against the stones like a restless ghost. Holmes tapped the roof of our cab. Here, driver, no further. We alighted into the damp darkness. Ahead, the colonel's carriage halted beside a derelict warehouse. Its driver remained motionless, his face lost beneath the brim of his hat. Holmes's eyes gleamed. We are on the edge of the web, Watson. Now, let us see who spins it. We crept along the embankment until the shadow of the warehouse loomed above us, its black timbers rising against the faint glimmer of the river. A single lamp glowed faintly through a crack in the boards. The damp air clung to my throat, heavy with the odour of hemp and oil. Holmes motioned me to silence. We slipped behind a stack of barrels that afforded a narrow view of the interior through a broken pane. Inside, by the flicker of a lantern, I saw Colonel Ashcroft in earnest conversation with a stranger, a lean, sharp-featured man whose accent, when he spoke, betrayed the harsh consonants of the continent. Herr Volkmann, whispered Holmes in my ear. A name well known to certain European collectors of illicit antiquities. 2 armed men stood at the far side, their hands resting lightly upon their revolvers. The air within was charged with tension, the stillness before an inevitable betrayal. Holmes's gaze shifted to the riverbank. "The police boat waits 50 yards downstream," he said softly. "When I raise my hand, they will close in. But until then, we watch." Through the crack, we could hear fragments of speech, the clink of coin, the scrape of metal. Then the colonel drew forth a long iron tube, setting it upon the table with deliberate care. Volkmann leaned forward, his eyes glittering. Holmes's hand brushed my sleeve. "The Chronicle changes hands tonight, Watson, if we are not swifter than the tide." The lamp within the warehouse flickered as though conscious of the drama unfolding beneath its light. "You will have your gold when I have proof," said Herr Volkmann coldly. "I am no fool to pay for what may yet be smoke and fancy." Colonel Ashcroft's reply was curt and controlled. "You question my word, sir. This tube contains the document, sealed as it was found. I demand my payment now." The German laughed softly. "And I, Colonel, demand honesty before generosity." Holmes's whisper reached me like the tightening of a spring. "Now, Watson." Quietly. We moved as one. Holmes slipped from behind the barrels, his revolver gleaming dully in the lamplight. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cool and unhurried, "this transaction is suspended. Scotland Yard has a prior claim upon that particular relic." For an instant, no one stirred. Then chaos erupted. One of the guards drew and fired. The shot splintered a beam above Holmes's head. I returned fire instinctively, while Holmes leapt forward with the agility of a cat. The lamp fell, sputtered, and cast wild shadows upon the walls. In the confusion, Ashcroft snatched the iron tube and dashed toward the river door. Holmes pursued, his coat whipping behind him. "To the water, Watson!" he shouted. "The chase begins!" As we burst into the night, the fog swallowed us whole. The hiss of the Thames rose in our ears like a monstrous breath, and the pursuit swept toward the dark, heaving river. The moment Holmes cried his warning, Colonel Ashcroft vanished through the rear door like a man pursued by destiny itself. We heard the clang of metal upon wood, followed by the creak of a winch and the sudden snarl of a small motor engine. By the time we reached the dock, the Colonel's boat was already cutting through the mist, its red lantern bobbing faintly in the gloom. "After him, Watson, quickly!" Holmes sprang aboard the nearest police launch, shouting orders with a clarity that cut through the confusion. The constables manned the oars, and in another instant we were upon the dark water, the engines sputtering as fog rolled thick around us. The river lay shrouded, its current cold and swift. From every quarter came the echo of hooves and shouts from the quayside, distorted and hollow in the night air. I could scarce distinguish the boundaries of water and sky. The world had dissolved into shadow and whispering tide. Holmes stood upright in the prow, his hand gripping the rail, his figure spectral in the mist. "Steady, men," he called. "Keep to the channel. There, that glow ahead. He cannot outrun the river." And indeed, through the curtain of vapour, the Colonel's faint red light wavered like a dying star. Holmes's voice, calm and unwavering, rose above the murmur of the waves. "The end is upon him, Watson." Fate rose faster than any man. We gained upon our quarry as the fog began to lift in thin veils, revealing the wide black surface of the Thames, glimmering under a ghostly moon. The Colonel's craft pitched wildly ahead of us, its engine labouring against the current. Holmes, crouched low, gave the order. "Now, full throttle." Our launch surged forward. I clung to the gunwale as the gap between us closed to mere yards. Holmes seized a boat-hook, and with a deft movement, caught the stern of Ashcroft's vessel. The two boats collided with a resounding crash that sent a wave of icy spray across us. Before I could call out, Holmes had leapt aboard the Colonel's craft. I saw them grapple, two dark figures locked in furious struggle, their shadows thrown against the mist by the wavering glow of the lantern. The Colonel fought like a cornered animal, striking wildly, his revolver flashing once, the shot whistling harmlessly into the void. Holmes, with the precision of a trained athlete, wrenched the weapon from his grasp. "Yield, Ashcroft!" he shouted. "The river is less merciful than justice." The colonel's answer was a guttural curse. He lunged again, slipping upon the slick deck. For an instant he clutched at the rail, then vanished into the churning black below. There was a single cry, muffled by the water, and then nothing. Holmes remained motionless for a moment, drenched and pale in the lantern's sickly light. Then, without a word, he stooped and lifted the iron tube from where it had fallen. Its surface gleamed cold and wet in his hands. As the police boat drew alongside, Holmes raised the cylinder in silent triumph. "The Chronicle is safe," he said quietly. "As for the colonel, the river has claimed its own accomplice." I saw in his face neither victory nor relief, but that grave acceptance which comes to a man who has seen justice served in its most inexorable form. Dawn was breaking as we made our way upstream, the fog thinning to a pale veil through which the city began to stir. Holmes sat in the stern, the recovered manuscript resting across his knees. Its metal casing, dented and dripping, gleamed faintly in the morning light. He regarded it with that peculiar mixture of detachment and reverence that I had often observed when some great enigma yielded to his intellect. "History," he said at last, "is a patient witness. It waits through fire, flood, and folly until someone dares to listen again." I, meanwhile, could not shake the image of Ashcroft's final moment, the defiant grasp, the sudden fall, the silence that followed. The river, indifferent as eternity, had swept over him without trace. "The Chronicle will return to the archives," Holmes continued, "but its meaning will remain unchanged. Those who sought to bury truth have only deepened its echo. The sins of the past, Watson, are the debts of the present, and they are always paid, though rarely by those who incurred them." He leaned back, his eyes fixed upon the brightening horizon. The oars dipped steadily, and behind us the fog closed like a curtain upon the night's tragedy. It was then I realized that the true relic was not the Chronicle itself, but the lesson it bore, that truth, though submerged, never truly drowns. It was nearing 4 o'clock when Holmes and I at last regained Baker Street. The fog of the Thames still clung to our coats, carrying with it the chill breath of that grim pursuit. We spoke little on the journey. The night's events had pressed too heavily upon the mind for idle comment. Once within our familiar sitting room, Holmes knelt before the fire, setting the recovered metal cylinder upon the hearth to dry. The flames played across its dull surface, revealing dents and scratches, mute testimony to the violence that had accompanied its salvation. I sank into my chair, overcome by fatigue, while Holmes, with the air of a man performing a sacrament, wiped away the river's stain and laid the relic upon the table. For several minutes he regarded it in silence. "What we hold, Watson," he said at length, "is not a mere artifact of parchment. It is the confession of a dynasty, a truth so long submerged that men have mistaken its silence for virtue." His voice had lost its triumph. It was grave, almost mournful. The dawn that filtered through the curtains found us thus, two weary men before a fire whose warmth could not dispel the chill of revelation. With hands as steady as those of a surgeon, Holmes broke the seal of the iron tube and drew forth the long roll of parchment. The script, though faded and water-stained, was yet legible to his trained eye. He unrolled it upon the table, and for a moment we both stood in reverent silence before that fragment of the past. "There," said he, indicating a passage in the margin, "lies the seed of our entire affair." I bent over the text, the Latin faint yet decipherable. "Eustachius Darnley, qui fidem coronae fregit, et conjuravit cum hostibus regis." Eustachius of Darnley, who broke faith with the crown and conspired with the king's enemies. Beneath it ran another hand, more modern, in darker ink. "By decree of His Majesty, let this record be expunged from all chronicles henceforth." Holmes's gaze lingered upon those words. "A treachery buried by royal command," he murmured. Thus a noble line was cleansed, and a nation's history edited to spare its favourites. The past, my dear Watson, is not dead. It merely waits for light. I could not but feel the awe of centuries pressing upon that single sheet. The weight of deceit varnished into heritage. To think that one page, had it seen daylight, might have shattered a family and shaken a throne. Holmes rolled the manuscript once more with solemn care. "We have reached the heart of the labyrinth," he said quietly. "Now comes the choice between justice and mercy." Later that morning, we delivered the Chronicle into the trembling hands of Mr. Alaric Venn at the Royal Archives. The poor curator, pale and unshaven from his ordeal, received it as though welcoming a lost child. "My dear Mr. Holmes," he stammered, "this is a service beyond gratitude. The document shall be restored, preserved, guarded." Holmes raised a hand. "Guard it, yes, but guard too what it contains. There are truths, Mr. Venn, that should rest within stone walls rather than printed columns." I noted the faint emphasis in his tone, and saw that he made no mention of the Darnley name. Venn, too overwhelmed to perceive the omission, promised that the manuscript would be secured under the strictest supervision. As we left the archives, I could not refrain from remarking, "You have spared the Darnleys, Holmes." He smiled faintly. "I have spared England, Watson, a scandal of antiquarian flavour but poisonous consequence. We pursue justice, not vengeance, and sometimes the two are as far apart as Westminster from the riverbank." In that moment, I realised that Holmes had acted not merely as the detective of crime, but as the custodian of discretion, a quality rarer, perhaps, than truth itself. It was not until the evening that Holmes, seated once more by our fire, disclosed the final thread of the tapestry. "You will have perceived," he began, "that the motive lay not in greed, but in fear, the most corrosive of all emotions." He drew from his pocket a small envelope, sealed with an initial L. "This," he continued, "was found among Colonel Ashcroft's effects. It is written in a woman's hand." He broke the seal and read aloud in measured tones. "For my husband's sake, Colonel, I implore you, destroy the page. Let the past rest, and you shall be rewarded. No price is too great if silence may be kept. L.D." Holmes folded the letter carefully. "Lady Darnley," said he, "was the true architect of this tragedy. Her trembling hands told me so long before her words. She feared not for herself, but for the man whose pride she could not wound with knowledge of his tainted blood. She sought to bury a ghost, and raised one instead." I felt a pang of pity for the unhappy woman, whose love had driven her into deceit and ruin. Holmes's expression softened. "You see, Watson, fear and affection are but two sides of the same coin. She sinned not from malice, but from devotion, and that, in the eyes of conscience, is punishment enough." He leaned back, his eyes half closed. In the end, history is not written by the victors, but by the fearful. The following day brought a calm after the storm, a strange tranquillity that settled upon Baker Street like the hush of resolution. Holmes appeared contemplative, his long fingers interlaced as he gazed into the hearth. "It is curious, Watson," he said, "how power may conceal its stains for a time, yet never quite efface them. Truth survives in the margins, in footnotes, in half-burned letters, in the conscience of those who dare to look back." He gestured toward the window, where the city stirred beneath the pale spring light. "Ink fades," he mused, "but conscience does not. The Chronicle is safe, though I sometimes wonder if it was ever the parchment that needed saving." I made no reply. There was in his tone that rare melancholy which came to him only when intellect gave way to reflection. As I laid down my pen that night, I found myself dwelling not on the crime, but on the strange mercy of its conclusion. Holmes had restored a relic, unmasked a conspiracy, and yet left untouched the fragile dignity of those who had erred through fear. Thus ended the affair of the stolen Chronicle, not in triumph, but in quiet understanding. And once again, I marvelled that beneath Sherlock Holmes's cold precision beat a heart as compassionate as it was just. It was past sunrise when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The fog that had drifted up from the river clung still to our coats, lending the air of the Thames to our very hearth. We were both silent, though not from fatigue alone. There are hours when words seem but an intrusion upon thought. Within the familiar haven of 221B, the fire burned low, the clock ticked in its accustomed rhythm, and the faint aroma of Holmes's tobacco wound through the air like a lingering echo of the night's endeavour. I remember feeling, as I removed my gloves, the curious comfort of repetition, that quiet domestic rhythm which followed each storm of action in our singular partnership. Yet my mind refused repose. The image of Lady Darnley haunted me. Her frail hands, her haunted eyes, her tragic love. Justice had been served, perhaps, though not in the form I had once believed inevitable. I felt relief that the truth was preserved, but sorrow that its light had burned so close to the heart of the innocent. Holmes sat unmoving before the hearth, and the reflected glow traced the calm austerity of a man who had looked once more into the mirror of human frailty, and found no surprise there. As the day wore on, I could not shake a certain heaviness of spirit. The morning papers, strewn across the rug, would soon carry their version of the night's events. A theft foiled, and a man lost to the river. But they would never speak of what truly lay behind the matter. Fear, love, and the long shadow of ancestral shame. Holmes had said nothing since our return, save to remark that the fog was thinner than men's secrets. At last I spoke. Holmes, I cannot help but feel that mercy has stood where justice ought to have walked. He did not look at me, but his lips curved faintly. Then perhaps, my dear Watson, mercy has the longer stride. His words, simple though they were, struck me deeply. I am, by profession, accustomed to the treatment of wounds, but there are injuries, moral and unseen, that no medicine can heal. I thought of Lady Darnley, condemned to carry her conscience as others carry a scar. I thought too of Holmes himself, that curious blend of reason and pity, so often concealed beneath his mask of analysis. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. You see, Watson, justice is but the anatomy of truth, mercy, its pulse. For once I found no answer. In the afternoon, Holmes rose and went methodically about his accustomed ritual of closure. It was a scene I had witnessed after many a case, and yet, this time, it carried the gravity of an epilogue. Upon the table lay the familiar array of small telling relics, the blue fragment of silk, a pinch of cigar ash, a folded slip of Latin text copied from the Chronicle's margin. Each was examined, then placed in order with meticulous care. From his drawer, Holmes drew forth a folder and inscribed upon it, in his neat, angular hand, "See, the affair of the stolen Chronicle." Beneath it, he wrote a single line from Horace, "Veritas temporis filia." "Truth," he murmured, "is the daughter of time, though she is seldom raised by honourable parents." He placed the folder upon the shelf beside others of equal significance, yet wholly different complexion, the silent testament of a lifetime's pursuit. As he closed the cabinet, Holmes's expression softened. A man's honour, Watson, is as fragile as parchment, and as easily scorched. He turned from the files with a faint sigh. And so we preserve what can be preserved, and forget what must be forgotten. It is the only balance mankind has yet devised. For some time after, neither of us spoke. The coals in the grate settled with a faint sigh, sending sparks upward like fleeting thoughts. Then Holmes turned, his face lit half by fire, half by shadow. "History, my dear Watson," he said slowly, "is a mirror we polish only on one side. Sooner or later, the dust of truth will settle upon it again. He rose and stood by the window, gazing out upon the awakening city. Men think they bury their past beneath stone or hide them in ink. Yet manuscripts burn, dynasties fall, and still the truth escapes, light as smoke, indestructible as conscience. They may rewrite the Chronicle, but they cannot rewrite themselves. I ventured that perhaps it was better so, that ignorance sometimes served mercy. Perhaps, he answered thoughtfully, but ignorance is a poor shelter, Watson. The wind of truth finds every crack. It is not the knowing that destroys a man, but the fear of being known. He turned back to the fire, his eyes reflective, his voice lower. We imagine we live in the present, yet the past breathes beside us still. Every family, every nation carries its ghosts. The Chronicle we recovered was but a page. The greater manuscript is written upon the hearts of men, and there the ink never fades. I could find no reply. His words seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken, mingling with the crackle of the dying fire. Evening deepened, and the room grew still save for the faint hum of the city beyond. Holmes sat motionless, his gaze fixed upon the embers that glowed like fragments of the truth itself, fierce for a moment, then turning quietly to ash. Outside, London awakened to another indifferent day. Hansom wheels rattled over wet cobbles, and the world resumed its restless routine. Yet within Baker Street, a peculiar hush prevailed, as though the air itself acknowledged the weight of what had been unveiled. I studied my companion's profile in the firelight, the fine ascetic lines, the composure of a man forever balancing intellect and solitude. For all his brilliance, there was in him that rarest quality of all, compassion without illusion. At length he stirred and spoke almost to himself. Strange is it not, Watson, that the dead so often guide the living, and that truth, like the tide, always returns to the shore it once left behind. He fell silent once more, and I took up my pen to record the final chapter of the affair. For I knew that when history forgot this case, the lesson of it, and the quiet mercy of Holmes, would endure. Holmes sat motionless by the fire, his profile etched against the fading glow. The recovered Chronicle rested upon the mantelpiece, like a relic absolved of its sins. After a long silence, he said quietly, "It is curious, Watson, how men will stain their hands to keep history spotless. Yet truth, however long it sleeps, will always find breath again." I nodded, reflecting on Lady Darnley's trembling hands, on the river fog, on the parchment that had cost so much to preserve. Do you believe she acted out of love, Holmes, or out of fear? Holmes's eyes met mine. The difference, my dear fellow, is often merely the century in which one lives. He rose then, drawing his dressing gown about him, and the fire crackled softly in the stillness of Baker Street. But tell me, dear listener, if you held a secret that could destroy a legacy, would you reveal it, or let it sink quietly into the river of time? If this case stirred your thoughts, share your answer below. And if you enjoy walking these shadowed streets with Holmes and me, do subscribe for more mysteries, and bring a friend to join us by the fire next time.